Well, thanks everyone for coming along. We've got a fair few people registered for this one, so exciting to jump in. For those who haven't attended to any of our webinars before, we usually do a monthly session, so we hear a lot of questions and queries and topics that some people find interesting. So we think if some people get value out of it, maybe there's a lot more people in our audience that probably would get value too. So for this one, part of our series, we interview experts in the industry to share some pretty common questions and hopefully solve some answers for yourselves. So for this week, one we get quite regularly is the very very grey area of XCAT, and I guess one thing we get questioned a lot is what are we liable for? What can I do? What can't I do? Can I just do everything under that category and get away with it? Probably not, but probably instead of us trying to answer those questions and try to decipher a lot of the law, we thought probably the best person to talk to about this would be Tom Pills, who we've known for many years at the company and is the drone lawyer at Macmillan Law. So yeah, thanks so much, Tom, for joining us, mate.
Thanks for hosting, Alex, and thanks for having me, Dave. Appreciate that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, mate. We've got Dave Cole, our CEO and founder here as well. So Dave's got a wealth of
Good day,
knowledge.
everybody.
Awesome. Dave's got a wealth of knowledge with compliance and worked in the industry for many years. So probably the best team here we can probably answer a lot of these questions with. So
Yeah,
yeah, we'll jump in.
I'm here to stump. I'm here to stump Tom. That's my role.
Yeah. Call Tom out on some things. Awesome. So I guess on this one here, we'll be focusing on X category. I guess what are you liable for? We've got a few scenarios here. Thank you also to those who sent through some questions. So some very good questions there for Tom, and we'll dive through. But basically, we'll go through a bit of a format, and then the last section we've got a bit of a Q&A session. So if thoughts pop up, feel free to add them in the question section there, and we'll get to it at the end. But yeah, we'll sort of do that on the last 15 minutes or so. But without further ado, we'll jump straight into it. So, Tom, welcome, mate. Thanks so much. And maybe we might start off with maybe share a bit about yourself for the audience. I guess what's your career been? What do you work in sort of law and aviation right now, and the sort of work you're involved with?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the opportunity. Super brief. I've been a lawyer for about 11 years now. Been in the drone space since about 2018. Started off as a graduate accountant, but thought I'd do even more stupid thing and then move straight into law. Like I said, covered many years of law, mainly commercial, and then since, like I said, 2018, flew recreationally, and then in 2018 sort of realised the regulation was pretty robust, and the government seemed to be promoting RPAS pretty strongly in Australia by way of its regulation. So I've been in that space since about 2018, and just since then, reading and writing about it and trying to get across it. And the industries and work, it's been super varied, which has been cool, from software providers advising through to hardware manufacturers, through to obviously pilots directly, as well as listed companies and state entities that have drone programs. So it's been a pretty wide sort of scope of work of different clients, which has been really cool. Which has worked things from technical advice on Part 101 and liability issues through to negotiating with CASA for show causes and those types of investigations as well.
Fantastic. Great. We'll just jump into the next, probably go right to the first question, I guess, probably what everyone's thinking. I guess, could you give, we get a bunch of people on these webinars who some are quite advanced in their drone experience, some are just getting started. So maybe just to set the scene, what's could you give some background to the X category in drones, I guess, from your perspective of who was it intended for and what sort of operations is it sort of meant for in the industry?
Yeah, appreciate that. And I know we might have, I'm taking that most people here quite sophisticated, but we will go back to basics as well, because as far as I'm concerned, you can never go wrong brushing up with fundamentals. Even though I do it all the time to make sure I've got the fundamentals right, as well as the really tricky, sophisticated stuff. So I'll keep it pretty broad, but general assumption that people have a general idea. So as most people are aware, like excluded RPA operations, typically they're deemed low risk, and then therefore they're excluded from the requirements to get full certification. You don't need a ReOC or a REPL, depending on that type of operation. So it's, CASA says for low risk. And just to brush up on the meaning of excluded, and I appreciate many of you know this, but to brush up, that's probably where it's contained in 101.237 of the Civil Aviation Safety Regs. And that pretty much defines excluded as very small RPA. If you recall, very small RPA is gross weight of more than 250 grams, but not more than 2 kilograms. So very small RPA is excluded if it's operated under the standard RPA operating conditions. And we move up to small RPA, and that's defined as having a gross weight more than 2 kilograms, but not more than 25 kilograms. And a small RPA is excluded if it's operated under the standard RPA operating conditions and under the landholder rule, and there's no remuneration. And then for medium RPA, which is gross weight of more than 25 kgs, but not more than 150, that's excluded if it's operated by someone with a REPL and under the RPA operating conditions and the landholder rule. So medium RPA excluded, kind of not really excluded, but they still have it in there. And notably with that as well, micro is considered not part of excluded, which is micro obviously 250 grams and less. They're not counted as excluded, but they're subject to regs like 101A of the regs, and also this sneaky direction 2222. If you haven't seen direction 22/22, have a look, because it's this like little list that just supplements the regulations. And it's got a bunch of rules you probably know, but it broadens the scope of who's captured by some of the regs, this direction. Happy to provide links to this afterwards.
Yeah, awesome. That's great.
And in general, it says that micro, you still can't fly above 400 feet AGL, not in emergency operations, 30-meter rule, one to one, no swarms, and visual line of sight. So micros are still covered by many of the protections. But micro is not excluded, but it's got its own regime of protection. And so then that sort of sets what excluded are. And then obviously it was subject to the standard RPA operating conditions. And I'm sure many of you probably know these off the back of your hand, and they're set out in 101.238 of the regs. And do you want me to run through basically the standard RPA operating conditions, Alex?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, maybe we just quickly cover that, because I think that's probably worthwhile for everyone on the call.
Yeah. So if you're flying excluded, you generally have to stick with all of these, which is so operate in Australian territory, basic one, and then with always within visual line of sight of the pilot. To be operated below 400 feet AGL, and we all know AGL above ground level. So if there's a mountainous terrain, you can follow it as long as you always remain 400 feet above ground level, depending on where the ground is, which can vary obviously if it's an undulating environment. It's got to be by day generally. The 30-meter rule applies in the excluded, and that's for people who are not directly associated with the operation of the RPA. So people who are directly associated with the operation, they're not subject to the 30-meter rule. And the 30-meter rule, the best way I've seen it described by Castra actually is the 30-meter cylinder around the drone, which is pretty big in an urban or suburban environment. But when you get more to the bigger sites, it's not so bad. And then you can't operate in a prohibited or restricted area as defined in the regs. You're not to fly over a populous area, and populous, you probably aware, is a dynamic definition. So a footy field Wednesday morning with no one there is not populous, but that footy field Sunday morning with 100 people is populous. So the populous is a dynamic definition. Also can't fly within 3 nautical miles of the movement area of a controlled aerodrome. 3 nautical miles is about 5.5 Ks. And a lot of you would know that the Part 101 manual standards has a lot of bits and pieces around controlled aerodromes and flying and aprons and bits and pieces. So there's always been some debate about that, but the general rule is not 3 nautical miles within the movement area of a controlled aerodrome, and controlled aerodromes are one with an active air traffic control tower. Then the last 2 requirements are generally not allowed to fly where there's a fire, police, or other public safety operation, other than unless you have the approval of the person in charge. So, and then the last point is 1-to-1, so no swarms, one RPA to one pilot. And they're the restrictions typically which you're subject if you're running in excluded.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Right, that's definitely set the scene. So that's great. And I see some questions coming in. So thanks for that. So I guess
sorry, if just go back, Alex. I'll just ask a couple of other questions just around the regs talk a lot about the operator. Can you elaborate in the context of excluded who the operator is? And how that because a ReOC operator can be a person, it can be an organization,
Yes. Yeah. No,
how does that dynamic work in the context of the regs? For example, can an organization be an excluded operator?
Good question. Well, so typically, because the excluded refers to, or the excluded applies to the RPA. So once an operation is conducted under those requirements, it's excluded. And the operator, there's further material further down about this, but the operator is typically the the person who controls. So, which is normally the employer. ReOC holder is normally the operator, whereas the PRC pilot in command is the pilot. So the operator is often not the pilot, but the person sort of running the show.
Yeah.
And so there's the CASA's Advisory Circular 101-01, which was updated May 2024, is super handy. It interestingly points out that ReOC holders can conduct operations in excluded category, but the CASA's view is the excluded operations are separate to and cannot be conducted under a ReOC, because by definition, they're excluded from the requirements of a ReOC. And I've talked with people in the industry that go, no, my excat, they're under the ReOC, don't care. But, I'm happy to, sometimes what's written and what happens can be two different things. I appreciate that. But CASA's Advisory Circular does say that excluded ops are separate to and not conducted under a ReOC. And that means that the excluded RPA operations neither receive the privileges of the ReOC, as we know, or any instruments under the ReOC, nor are they bound by the conditions of the ReOC holder. So as far as CASA is concerned, it's advisory circular, and advisory circulars are the lowest rung on authority. So you can't really go to court and point the advisory circular, but it is handy guidance in their view. And I haven't cross-checked to the regs, which would be authoritative as to where that sits in the regs, because obviously CASA's got it from somewhere. The dev current view is very separate. If you're excat, you're not under the ReOC. And follows from that is excluded operations must comply with those standard operating conditions, therefore cannot be issued with approvals and can't operate contrary to those because they're not under the ReOC. So that's
awesome. That's great, man. Thanks, mate. That's a great question. Dave, do you have another one there, man?
No. I think it's just coming back to the in the context of the regs. As a individual gets an RPA operator accreditation, versus a REPL or operating under a ReOC, that they are kind of what the regs are talking about, right? That they are the operator in that context.
Yeah,
if that's correct.
Yeah, I'll have to double check the regs. Operator in other legislation, other aviation legislation, refers to more the license or the certificate holder. I'll take this notice and double check and can answer this separately, definitely, and put this out to everybody about the operator. My understanding is typically person in control, so the person over the top, which is typically the employer or the ReOC holder, or the person under whose direction you're operator. It's not necessarily the person on the sticks.
Yeah. So all I was getting at is it's actually not clear. Like, I actually don't think it's clear.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the challenges. I'll
double check if I can find any clarity just to help everybody. Definitely, I'll put that on notice and come back to you for sure on if there are definitions, or if not, furthers the point that it is unclear.
Awesome, great, thanks, though, mate. Awesome. So I guess that probably flows. You might have just covered a little bit of that then, but I guess the way it should be managed, and I guess taking this from the approach of, I guess a lot of people on the call are from organizations that, might have 2 pilots sort of running XCAT, or might have 50, or there's an organization we spoke with at the start of the year that had a couple of hundred, and that's going to be the engineers or any sort of people sort of out and about in the field. But I guess, from an XCAT perspective, how should they be managed, I guess, from the company perspective? Yeah,
so to go backwards, I think to start with some of the record keeping, just to clarify that. Also, firstly, when the ReOC holder conducts operations under excluded, it should keep records. And an interesting point that the advisory circular mentions is that, so if you're a ReOC holder and you do operations under XCAT, you should keep records to demonstrate that it was excluded, because otherwise CASA will presume that any RPA operated conducted by a ReOC holder is included unless you have evidence to the contrary. That's CASA's advisory circular. So if you're flying XCAT, you should make a specific explicit note that it's excluded. Otherwise, it will be classified as included and therefore probably subject to the ReOC. If it's excluded, it's outside the ReOC. But if they presume it's included, then the ReOC is potentially affected. So there's that. So that was interesting guidance from CASA on that you should be explicit about that. Otherwise, they'll deem it to be included if you've got a ReOC. If you flew, it's under the ReOC.
Gotcha.
And that sort of brings into that record keeping in the Part 101 Manual of Standards, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. So, insofar as excluded, Division 10.3 of the MOS has record keeping requirements specifically for excluded, and that sets out the record. Oh, here, to answer your operator question, Dave, actually,
Yeah.
the MOS sets out record keeping requirements for the operator of an excluded RPA, and for this section of the MOS, an operator of an excluded RPA is the person who makes the relevant RPA available to the remote pilot.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
So I have to check. Sometimes definitions say this is a definition for this specific purpose, not for everything, but for the purpose of if you're operating. So if your employer is running XCAT and you're flying, the obligation to keep the records is by the operator, and that's the person making the RPA available to the pilot. So if it's a company that gives you your drone, that's the operator for the purpose of these records, your employer. And so as to what records you have to keep, if it's small or medium excluded, you have to keep an RPAS operational log. This is all detailed in the MOS. If it's a medium excluded, you also have to keep a remote pilot log for flight time and RPAS technical log. And also there's that standard notification to CASA before your first operation of excluded, which everyone has to do before the first flight. And so, yeah, there are. So it's worth checking out Division 10.3 if you're not familiar with it about log record keeping for XCAT, because it's not paper, it's not record free, and particularly in light of CASA saying if you're not documented as XCAT and you've got a ReOC, it'll be included under your ReOC.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. I was going to say, and that that sort of answer that question that you just said before around who's actually responsible for the XCAT ops in the company. You were saying it's the person who gives to the operator itself. No, sorry, the operator to the pilot. Is that right?
Who makes the RPA available to the pilot? The person who makes the RPA available. Yeah, it's not necessarily the pilot, but if your employer gives you a drone, then they're the ones who have to keep those records at least.
Gotcha. Great. Okay. And is that and not to throw a spanner in that, but is it if someone contracts someone to come on their site, hopefully if they had their own ReOC, but if they didn't and they come to your site and fly something under your banner, is it the same principle there as well? Because that person sort of is technically the operator?
Good question. Well, well, that's really tricky because if they're a contractor and brought, if they brought their own hardware, brought their own RPAS, then this would say that they're responsible for their own logs for that purpose because they supplied their own RPAS.
Mm-hmm.
But if you brought them on as a contractor and supplied them the RPAS under this operation, on this record keeping requirement, whoever makes it available is the person to get the records. Yeah, so that's really interesting actually. It might not make sense because you think a contractor is usually liable for their own shop, right? They come on, like you pay anyone to come and fix your house or whatever, they run their own shop. But this creates a bit of a grey area. In that if the contractor brings the RPAS, their records, if you provide the RPAS to the contractor, arguably you might have to keep those records, even if they're XCAT, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, it is that great line there. It's
important to notice, and I'm happy to always stand to be corrected, but this whole Part 101, whether it's Part 101 Manual Standards, regs, I'm yet to see it tested in court. There are no, as far as I'm aware, no big court cases that have interpreted how all these regs are to unfold. Like most areas of law, there's 1,000 cases. It's always do refer to case law here and there, but there's certainly law around drone footage as evidence in other cases, and that there's a lot of that. But as to just testing, what does these sections mean? Is it fair? Does it work? Is it legal? That hasn't been tested in court as far as I'm aware.
Interesting.
It's pretty crazy for law because most stuff has been tested, obviously.
Yeah, and it's always changing too. So I'd imagine that's yeah. Wow. Okay, that's great. I had a heap of questions there, but we're be smart on time, so I'll keep going.
I know. Yeah.
Awesome. So I guess, and for that one there, I know we spoke about this a couple of weeks back on a bit of back and forth on this, but I was curious to go, so from the same question, who's responsible? And then I guess from the liability perspective, I know you had some points around there around, I guess, damage to aircraft or in the different scenarios, I guess who's liable and does CASA sort of get involved with some of these XCAT breaches should they happen?
This is a bit of a web, so I'll try to unpack it as briefly as possible, but you could run a whole seminar series just on this stuff. But I'll try to keep it high level with just some takeaways so that the audience can, okay, cool, just some takeaways. So the liability, one way I've broken up is depends on whether there's damage sustained or whether you're sued by someone or just CASA investigating a paper breach, and you've breached a reg, but no one was hurt, no damage occurred, but CASA's going to investigate because you breached above 400 feet AG or whatever. So to unpack that first, looking at damage, you've got this damage by aircraft 999 Commonwealth law. There are state and territory or state equivalents of this, but typically aviation law is typically federal. It's Commonwealth, so it's countrywide. And just to hark on for a moment to our Australian Constitution, if a Commonwealth law and a state law are inconsistent, the Commonwealth law prevails to the extent of inconsistency. So Commonwealth law trumps state or territory law. That's typical rule. There's case law around that. But so back to that. So the Damage by Aircraft Act, pretty much what that does, it sets out the recovery of damages or money for certain injury, loss, or damage caused by aircraft or things falling off aircraft. So this is for people who were not aboard the aircraft. NARPAS, no one's aboard right now. I know there's things happening, but right now it's remotely piloted. No one's on board. So the damage by aircraft comes into play. And so what that act does, it provides that if an employee uses an aircraft in the course of their employment, whether or not they're authorized to do so, which is interesting, then for the purposes of the Damage by Aircraft Act, the employee is not taken to use the aircraft and the employer is taken to use the aircraft. And so what this does then, it makes the operator, so the operator being, as we discussed, the person who supplies the RPAS, and in some circumstances, the owner of the aircraft, not always. What the Act does, it allows damages to be recovered by someone who was injured, who wasn't aboard, without proof of intention, negligence, or other cause of action, and therefore treated as if that injury, loss, or damage had been caused by the willful act, negligence, or default of the defendant. So pretty much you don't have to prove any negligence, no intention, nothing. If an engine falls in your yard, for example, and your house is damaged, you can sue and recover a lot more easily than having to establish negligence, the intention, and all this other stuff. So it just allows people injured or hurt by an aircraft to recover much easier. And that's a risk pretty much every RPAS entity is assuming. And it generally doesn't apply if the aircraft was stolen. The Act sort of refers to that, which is good. And the liability there is reduced to the extent that person injured contributed to injury or damage. So, there's people poking lasers and stuff in the sky. If they were somehow injured by that, the court might go, well, how much do you contribute to your damage if they got hurt? So the court can do that. But in general, what the Act does, it makes it a lot easier to recover from injury from something coming off an aircraft. An aircraft, the definition of aircraft is broad to include RPAS, but just for completeness, it carves out model aircraft. So if you're flying your drone for sport or rec, you're typically not covered by the Damage by Aircraft Act. But I know most people here are RPAS, not model aircraft.
Right. So
that's the damage part. The second element of 3 is vicarious liability. And I know you may not, some of you may have heard that word, some may not. You know what it means. It pretty much means that where the employer is generally liable for damage caused by an employee during the course of their employment, but that's subject to negligence and being within the scope of your work. So it's a tricky one. So typically, if you make a mistake at work, the employer typically picks up the tab. There are a bunch of cases around that about where you are personally liable. So vicarious liability, where your employer is liable, and the other end of the spectrum is, no, sorry, you're personally liable because you did things that were intervening, therefore your employer is no longer liable. I've got a few quick cases, 3 little small cases. These are in the traditional aviation sector because, as I mentioned, I haven't found cases unpacking this in the RPAS sector yet. Not saying there aren't, but I haven't seen any yet, and I do look sort of regularly. There's this one case. It's called MATSAT against the Grove Flying Club. So this was a flight instructor. He was an employed flight instructor, and he was flying with a student. There was a partial engine failure. The instructor did not attempt an immediate emergency landing, and the aircraft crashed into trees beside the runway overrun. Unfortunately, the instructor passed away, not on the crash, but later from injury sustained. The instructor passed away, and the student had severe burns. This is an employer instructor. So unfortunately, the instructor, even though they passed away, their estate, so what was left of their money, were found negligent. The instructor was found negligent for not attempting an immediate emergency landing, and the instructor's estate was personally ordered to pay the student $1.6 million in damages.
Wow.
So even though they're an employee, because the court found they were negligent, they said, sorry, employer's not liable, you're personally liable, even your estate when they pass. Devastating, absolutely devastating. Another case, Nichols and Simon. So an air traffic controller was found 40% responsible for a mid-air collision, and then each pilot were found 30% at fault each. So the court can literally go pick and choose. It does it in a very, I don't know, they do it. It'd be a very tricky exercise, but the court can decide who's liable and literally pick percentages of who should be liable for certain parts of damage.
Wow.
And then the last case, this Skyways case, the court ruled that a mid-air collision occurred due to an air traffic controller's negligence in failing to maintain proper vigilance and warn pilots of danger, and no fault was attributed to the pilots. It was all attributed to the air traffic controller in that instance. Wow. So you're not always covered by your employer. And then, sorry, the third, and so that's the second point, that there is risk. Everyone does face risk. So if you're negligent, you're being foolish or stupid, the court can decide who is liable. And it's not always on the employer. And just the third element of all this liability stuff is just, I call it a paper breach, no damage. So if you've just flown above 400 AGL or whatnot. So when CASA issues a show cause, and the first thing often CASA will do when they investigate is issue someone a show cause, which says, show us cause why we shouldn't suspend or cancel or revoke your REPL or your accreditation. So they get a letter saying, here's the facts we know about. We think you've done this. You've been naughty. Tell us why we shouldn't cancel your REPL. And then the pilot has a chance, usually 28 days to respond and, just not negotiate or defend or whatnot. And so my professional experience, I've seen the aviation infringement notice, fine. I've seen that go to the pilot, and that's especially where excluded, because that operation is not technically under the ReOC. So often it'll go to the pilot. And so if you breach as a pilot, there is a level of personal liability for the fines. Look, whether your employer covers you and goes, oh, well, you're working, I'll cover the fine for you, it is another issue. But insofar as CASA is concerned, your slate is not clean. And if you get pinged again, CASA can say, well, they can use your previous infringements to take into account in later penalties. They can look at that and say, you've been on all these occasions. Then when you go to say, well, I'm sorry, they'll go, well, sorry may not cut it now because you've been pinged a number of other times. So yeah, there is a level of personal liability, even if you're flying as an employee. In my experience, they will issue that fine. And also, some organisations say, well, if you were flying outside the rules and being foolish, then your job's on the line as well. So you get double.
Interesting. Okay, because I know there was and yeah, that's just cautious of time again. But I think there was an interesting one you were saying a little while ago about the job description side of things. So I know, like for that example before around, if an engineer was like, oh, I've got to run out to site, but I'll just grab one of the smaller drones, and it's I think I can get away with it. I'm fine. I'll just throw it up in the air, and then something happens to it. Is there something around you saying if it's not in their job description, if they say they're there to operate, RPAS as part of their job, and if it's not in there, can it fall back to the employee as far as like their negligence?
I think that's a factor in deciding the level of vicarious liability and whether it was within the scope of their scope of conduct of what they're allowed to do. So job descriptions will help to say whether we're allowed to fly an RPAS or not. Will help in helping the employer to whether vicarious liability or not. So yeah, I would recommend job descriptions being very clear as to whether or not they can operate an RPAS. So if a surveyor suddenly is allowed to fly RPAS, perhaps if they are allowed to, it should be in their job description. And if for whatever reason explicitly not, or if you've got a policy that you must have a REPL to fly, then maybe there should be an exclusion or some sort of general company policy around that as well. And that's where SMSs can come in. Policies. There's usually stuff in your ops manual as a drone operator, but otherwise you can have just general company policies around what your drone policy is and circulate that. And also safety management systems. I don't know if you guys have done much with safety management systems, and for people who may not know, so your JSAs, your job safety assessments and stuff are for each operation, but your SMS, your safety management system, is for your entire operation, not a particular operation, but for how your entire organization manages safety. And having a comprehensive safety management system will help the company to say, well, we've got a system, we've circulated it, everyone has it, and reduces their liability in a sense, because it's being clear who's liable for what, and it's written.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, cool. Great. Great. I might just cautious of time. There's some really good questions coming through. I can see too. So I think there was one here a while ago, and I know this is always, as we've done probably a couple of times throughout this webinar, it's always good to just get a scenario to really think it through. And again, by no means is Tom accountable for any of this, but more of just taking advice and I guess looking down, I guess, in the particular scenarios because it's highly subjective. And I would imagine that one that I know Dave and I spoke about a while ago was if, say, a mining company or any sort of company with 30 pilots all operating under XCAT, one of the XCAT pilots loses control and crashes into a nearby private property and damages someone's car. I guess unpacking that scenario, starting with, I guess, what are the main liabilities in that case? So I guess who should be sort of somewhat nervous, I guess.
Well, back to those high level 3 points, I think helped us divide it. So, one, Damage by Aircraft Act typically provides that the employer will be liable for damage, typically. So that's number one, that's for the damage. Point two, for vicarious liability, that's where we look at job policies. Were they flying? Were they operating negligently, carelessly? So vicarious, then consider, okay, well, should the employee pick up the tab insofar as the vicarious liability issue, or should they try to push it back to the pilot? And then the third point of the paper breach, CASA will normally probably investigate the pilot and probably, I'd say, the operator as well. And if it's an included operational, if it's not excluded, there's definitely a closer link to the ReOC if they are operating included. If they're excluded, then the argument would be they're not connected to the ReOC. So that puts a bit more, probably pushes the liability closer to the pilot because they're not operating under ReOC per se. They're operating as an employee potentially, but not operating under a ReOC technically. So I think that they might, from my experience, the person operating might get the fine in the first instance. But CAS can investigate anybody easily. They've got a lot of power to investigate as far as wide as they want, pretty much.
Interesting. And that would be also too, as you're saying in the first couple of slides around if the organization had the ReOC, which is probably a sub question there, if the same scenario again, but there was maybe 3 of those 30 were ReOC pilots or operated with under the ReOC, and that same incident occurred, is that sort of what you're saying before, that you would have to prove that it was in fact an XCAT flight, or else they would assume it's potentially a ReOC one, or is that, I guess, what would that change? Yeah, that outcome.
Good point. Actually, you'd need those records for that because the presumption would be not excluded flight if there's a ReOC. That's right. Back to those records. That's a good point. Actually, I didn't appreciate that connection. That'd be the first assumption. But as to the liability, like I mentioned, I've seen the fines go to it depends how CASA becomes aware of it and if they're aware of the ReOC and if they're aware of the pilot. It sort of depends on how it all came about and who sort of, if it was reported or someone talked to CASA, are they told it was the company or are they told it was this pilot? And that's sort of how CASA might decide who to issue the fine to as well. Scenario by scenario, it's hard. I know I'm trying to get some high level just tips at least, but it's very case by case, unfortunately.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just on the excluded side, if there is no ReOC, then the organisation's unlikely to have an ARN, so CASA wouldn't necessarily know they exist, right?
CASA may not care from the perspective of the employer if they've just got there's no footprint in CASA. Definitely, good point. Because they just chase the pilot. They'll chase the pilot. That's the person to whom they have the link. Yeah.
Absolutely. Awesome. Again, I might just jump to Dave. Do you have any other questions on this scenario? Any other ones do you want to ask Tom before we move?
No, I think what's probably, I find interesting, like there's an assumption that CASA, there's nothing happening, like there's no enforcement happening. But Tom, you're seeing people actually get show causes and things like that, so that there is actually some activity happening.
That's from CASA either just looking at real estate photos and going, I don't like the look of that, or looking at Instagram videos, looking on socials. CASA will look at socials, then suddenly out of the blue, potentially find your handle and investigate you. Yeah. And obviously CASA isn't widely resourced to chase things down. So they're not resourced for that. So you might get a cause and go, that's not fair. Everyone's doing that. But unfortunately, that's no defense. If everyone's doing it, but I get pinged, it's potentially not fair and equal, but that's just the way it is. If you come to their attention, they'll investigate potentially. Yeah.
And sorry, one thing we haven't touched on, it just occurred to me, is the all these offences are strict liability. Did you want to just quickly elaborate on what that
Yeah,
means?
yeah. The best way to explain that is like speeding. If speeding is a strict liability offense, so it doesn't matter if you didn't know you were speeding, doesn't matter if you didn't know the speed limit. None of that matters. If you commit the act, then you're presumed to have breached the law. So it doesn't matter if you didn't know there was the 400 feet AGL rule, or you weren't, or you're flying above, didn't know you were. Doesn't matter. You can't say I didn't know. The only way you can do it, there's a defense called honest and reasonable mistake of fact. For example, if your control station's playing up and it said you're 300 feet AGL, but you're 500, then you could, and you thought you were operating within the law. There's a defense there, but you'd have to go to court, expert reports, software testing. It'd be very difficult. But I'm saying there is a defense to it, but it's a very tricky one. But in general, if you commit the act, you presume to have breached it. Doesn't matter if you didn't know or didn't mean to.
Interesting. Okay, so you should have some formal level of training then if you're presumed to know that regardless.
Oh yeah, that brings into account training, definitely. That brings into account the need for training as well, because not knowing, ignorance is no excuse of law applies very strongly for strict liability offenses.
No.
And I'd also say, and this is one of the hard things to always keep up with, is just the changes. CAS will issue a new directive or a new exemption, and it's up to you to be across that, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's like the Direction 2222, it is like I dig for this stuff because it's just my job. But if you weren't across it, and I appreciate most of all the participants here are busy operating, running businesses, doing all these things, and don't have time to sit at night and dig through some random direction tucked away in the legislation website. So yeah, it's tough. It's not easy. And I try to, you guys too, we all try to put resources out to bring people's attention to these things. And that's part of my remit, is to educate as much as advise as well, stop people getting in trouble in the first place.
Awesome. Absolutely. Awesome. Okay. Well, I was going to say there's probably we had some really good questions come through of the people who signed up. So I was going to ask, there's a few of them that stuck out. I was trying to condense. There were some really good ones, but these are probably the main themes of the four of them. But do you mind if I just ask you these before we jump to? Looks like people are already sending in some questions. So
yeah, cool. Yeah, sure.
So maybe on the first one, so should manufacturers be required to produce maintenance, servicing procedures, intervals, a schedule of outcomes expected?
Yeah, good question. Well, from a liability perspective, you've got that sort of product liability versus operator sort of error thing. So it's a fine line. It's a fine line. It depends if an incident occurs, did the ARP has malfunction, or was the pilot's issue, and that's always a potentially constant fight, even with self-driving cars and things like that. Product liability issues versus whether they should. I'm definitely I take more of a just a deal with what is, rather than trying to say what people, going to the policy side of things. But I think to cover themselves, manufacturers maybe should provide some sort of I don't know, guidelines. But it's a tough one, because there's that operator error versus issue.
There's a fine line to draw between the two. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Awesome. So I guess, and for so what insurance do we actually need when operating under a ReOC? That's a very big question. But I've
seen that often comes if you're doing big, or if you're a contractor doing big jobs, they often specify what insurance you will need. Usually it's like minimum $20 million public liability and things like that. But you may need RPAS extensions. So I don't go too deep into the insurance space. But all I can say is sometimes your general public liability policy, if you just have one and then brought drones into the business, may not cover your RPAS operations. And there definitely are some insurers include it, and some people have RPAS extensions and things like that. So I'd just be in touch with the insurance broker. If your drones aren't explicitly covered, or you brought them in newly and you're doing things with the risk, I'd recommend speaking to your insurer or insurance broker to see whether your current policy covers RPAS, and if not, do you need an extension or a whole new policy? Yeah,
gotcha. Okay, so even so, the owner operators who are doing their own stuff, better off just consulting with their existing to say, is this covered or not, if something were to happen.
Yeah, if you're not insured, if you've got some general online policy, you'd have to just make sure it's not excluded. If it's not, that aircraft may not be excluded or whatnot. So insurers will fight not to pay sometimes. So make sure it is covered. So if you haven't used an RPAS specific insurer, it's just a general policy, I'd just double check to make sure RPAS operations would be covered, or go to an RPAS specific insurer. Yeah. It's not necessarily generally covered, my experience. You
Great.
might be, but I'm saying I'd check. Yeah.
Yeah.
Last thing you do is make a claim. You pay all these premiums. The last thing you do is make a claim and go, oh, sorry, that's exclusion 2.3, page 400 down there.
Yeah. And chances are they'll definitely do that. So yeah, good. That's a good call.
Yeah.
Great. All right. And so then on next one, so we got, is it possible to have pilots operate under your ReOC if they only have an operator's accreditation of flying less than 250 gram RPA?
Yeah, good question. So that point, that AC advisory circular tends to indicate that no, if you're not, if you have a REPL and you're just under accreditation or micro, you technically are not under the ReOC. Like you're probably still operating under the employer, like the ReOC holder, but technically you're not under the ReOC per se. And again, people have said different. People said to me, "No, don't believe that. They're under the ReOC." So
yeah, we're all good.
but technically speaking, they shouldn't be able to have. They shouldn't be have any of the benefits nor any of the burdens that come with the ReOC. It's sort of the point.
I actually think that there's an explicit statement in that advisory circular now around this. I can't remember the exact wording, but it explicitly says it's its own thing. It is not ReOC. It's not excluded.
Interesting.
Yep. No, it is. Yep. Well, right. I can quote you that version 2. How's this for a clause? 2.3.3.5 says excluded operations are separate to and cannot be conducted under a ReOC, as by definition they are excluded from the requirement of a ReOC. So, and again, the advisory circular is not gospel, but it's drafted by CASA and it's put out there by CASA. Yeah. So you're right, Dave. It is explicit.
And sorry. No, I think there's another one around micro. There's an explicit one around micro as well.
Yeah. My name, because micro is just a completely separate beast.
Yeah, it's a totally separate thing.
That's right. No, they are quite clear that micro is not excluded, and it's a third category. Yep, exactly. I agree with that.
Awesome. All right, and then the last one here before we jump to the other ones is how would you explain drone laws currently? That's a massive question, and probably more specific is like, are they sustainable as they are? I guess sort of sounds like the question sort of what's the current state or what's your perception of the current drone laws?
Yeah, we've got some people say we've slowed down the last few years and fall behind a bit, but I think we have a very robust legislative framework, and it's a fine line between the regulations facilitating commerce, facilitating aviation, facilitating operations, but then strangling the operators. I think a lot of operators just go, oh my, there's so much red tape, I can't even take off. And I appreciate there's that problem. And it's hard because when the wing aviation's drone delivery started in Australia, and I think that's because we had a very good, robust regulatory framework. It was clear, it was set out what to do, and they started here. Of course, they had bottomless pockets, so it's the hardest part is the red tape and it's expensive. So we have a very robust regulatory framework. And I'm sure operators on here themselves have a view on, yes, we have a good law so I can follow what I have to do. I know what I don't have to do. That's good. Or they go, this is all just red tape. That's why we've got to get footage. So yeah, it depends where you're coming from. And I appreciate the strangulation concern, but also the facilitation of, complex operations requires red tape
going between the two.
Yeah, you can debate that all day as to what's good, what's too much law, what's not enough law.
Yes, 100%. I think that's probably the most we encounter with, and it's probably a product thing for us is in a perfect world, we want to have large mine sites, large companies, all these pilots just basically fly whenever they need to. And as you said, they got deadlines to meet and KPIs. They need to fly the stuff, get home and sort of do the work. But I think you can't take it too flippantly. There's some serious stuff at risk and there's some hardcore stuff there, but there is definitely a fine bell curve balance to really get that optimization of too much of it. No one does it. And no doubt drones are incredibly valuable to a lot of these organizations. So the faster we can get them using it, the better in a safety.
And too much red tape means, well, the other thing's going to fly illegally because it's just too much and they fly anyway, or they don't fly and it strangles the industry. So there's the other two things of too much. And then you've got obviously privacy stuff, surveillance devices stuff, trespass stuff. There's outside CASA, there's all this other stuff as well. And the Department of Infrastructure has put out some really interesting stuff as well. They've got their own drone site in addition, and they've got the whole of government approach and stuff. And Department of Infrastructure has put out some awesome drone privacy guidelines that helps to also encapsulate the privacy law. It's not prescriptive, but it gives you really, and I can share that booklet too. It's got some really cool privacy principles in there for that aspect of operations.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, we can definitely share that one. That'd be great. Okay, let's I might even, there's a few things sort of wrapping up here, but I'm just cautious of time. I might just jump to the Q&A because we've got a lot of them coming in at the moment, if that's all right. I will say, sorry, the details there. I know Tom's obviously very much an expert in his field. So if anyone has any questions or keen to work with Tom, his details are there. I know there's a lot of information on his website as well. So feel free to reach out. And then also our details are always there if anyone has any other follow-up questions. I will point out we are doing, which is very timely, we are doing some work at the moment now to hopefully capture a lot of these XCAT operations that seem to be in this chaotic bucket and some new functionality soon. So if anyone's interested or has a lot of large XCAT operations, feel free to join the wait list, and we send out some information and some early releases to everyone on that list. So that's the screen there. But I'll jump quickly to we got some time left. A lot of questions. We've got 8 questions coming in. A lot of them from an anonymous attendee, so I can't call out the person, but I will say the question. I guess first one is why does the license go up to 7 kilo RPA with load when the category goes from 2 to 25?
Big question. That's the training thing, right? They're the training. That's the training. Yeah. Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know
Why the
either.
training
Yeah,
just says 7. I
I'm
know
not sure the origin.
the only other time I've seen 7 is in the model aircraft. We're not talking model aircraft at all, but that's the only other time I've seen 7 kg mentioned is model aircraft. But I know that's not even part of this equation right now.
Mm.
But no, I don't know why I don't know off the top why the training goes to 7, then goes up. Well, that's it. Maybe they just pick that as a pluck that out as a sort of a if it's open to 20, 25 is a lot heavier, obviously.
Mm.
Cass just pluck that as a number that's sort of safe, and you need a few more quals to actually, or a bit more training to go up to 25.
Yep.
The Moss might answer that, but I don't know at the top. Sorry, I don't know why. It seems
Yeah,
strange.
right.
It's not in line with anything else in the regs.
Interesting. Interesting. All right. Cool. So the next one would be if you have a ReOC, why would you fly excluded? And that's probably to Dave and Tom there, but that's a pretty big answer there.
Dave, do you have a view on that?
I mean, it's just the feedback we get from customers, and a lot of it is just around paperwork. Essentially the sub 2 kg operations, just wanting to lower the burden for end users. So
Mm.
that's typically why it happens. My understanding.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
a bit simpler, as we've unpacked today. There are still supposed to be record keeping
But
requirements, but generally just it's just seen as easier as well. Oh, it's XCAT.
yeah,
Geez, I don't care with the ReOC. It just feels, even if it's not much more, it probably feels psychologically just easier, operationally easier.
and I think that's one of the things we're trying to convey today is it may be easier in terms of paperwork, but there's possibly some things it opens up which you may want to consider, right? Like
Mm.
just being fully informed
Mm.
Yeah,
when going down this road of what you need to do, what you need to cover off.
Mm.
yeah.
And I agree. I think it's a pretty good point. I think there's a few organizations we interact with, and I think there's some that to that point there might be some really complex, more advanced operations that they go onto their ReOC for. And as you said, that you've got to get your approvals and do the right processes and have the right documentation. And sometimes excluded, as you said, feels like it's just a far easier or a simpler version of it. But as you mentioned before, you've got XCAT can be the back of I hear the phrase the tool in the back of the truck. So from engineers or inspectors or people who just go out on site. But as you said today, it's like if you don't have the right record keeping or having something behind you, CASA can assume that, particularly if you have a ReOC, that you are operating under the ReOC. So you got to justify and keep your records. It's definitely not a set and forget. So yeah, I think that's pretty important.
I only discovered that recently. It's quite interesting that CASA makes that presumption of not excluded unless you say it is if you've got a ReOC. So that was interesting piece of guideline from CASA.
Awesome, awesome. There's even more coming through. I was going to say, if we run out of time today, I'll maybe we can answer them sort of manually via the follow-up. But
The fireside chat.
yeah, absolutely. So there's another one I was going to say, I'll work my way down the list. So the next one was, so for context, this person owns a less than 249-gram RPA privately that employed by a local government, no controlled airspace airfields around. For controlled airfields, I would like to know to use the RPA to take aerial photography, landscape, weed areas, herbicide treatment areas over time for my reports, sometimes involving within less than 3 nautical miles of these uncontrolled airfields, also being the air flights. Am I in breach of CASA regs by using the RPA for photography related to my work duties, even though I'm not being paid for this photography? That's a big question.
That's
No,
many limbs and it gets a bit advicey.
I think and correct me if I'm wrong, the commercial requirement kicks in on the above 2 kilos in the excluded category, and that sub 250 gram would be in micro. You just have to check the wording on that, but I think you can use micro for commercial activities.
Well,
But
because
I can't remember.
model aircraft is obviously very explicit at what it is, and you would have. I'm sure most of you know that the definition of RPAS is almost a negative. It's like it's not a model aircraft balloon, or I forgot the other definition. So the model aircraft is very explicit. Whatever's not model aircraft, sport or reg or under 7 kgs in a school or uni, anything other than that, RPAS. Just RPAS is the catch for. So model aircraft is the really positive definition, and RPAS is like the backstop. Anything not covered in model aircraft, bam, RPAS. And I think that, and Dave, we can tussle over this, and happy to we can definitely work it out separately, work it out together. That I think micro commercially, and I know it paid for the flight, but if that's part of a commercial thing, you're charging the council at some point, and that makes up part of that commercial product. I'd say that slips into commercial because if it's not sport or rec, it's RPAS.
Yeah. And what I'm saying, I think you can do that under micro. My understanding, but happy to be corrected.
Are you talking for the money aspect or the
the money aspect? Yeah.
Interesting. All right, cool. Jump to the next one. So we've got, this might have been partway through, so we might have missed the context behind this one, but Riley asked, does that definition apply elsewhere or just to record keeping? So
operator. Yeah, that one. Yeah,
right. Okay.
Good question. I will check.
Yeah,
I am keen to check whether that was just for that record keeping, or whether operator is more broadly defined in the regs. And I'll put that on notice. I'll have a look, see if we can do that, see if we can find that. So.
Gotcha. Awesome. Next one, so we got from Kevin here. So he said, I just got my REPO, so my Ripple. If I lend my DJI sub 2 kilo to my friend, and he's doing it for commercial purposes, is he liable or am I?
I think this is coming back to the definition you were talking about in providing the RPA. Who provides the RPA?
Yeah, that was in the record keeping context. So that's liability. Typically falls to the pilot first. If someone is operating, typically falls to the pilot first for fines and things. But that can get a bit tricky, especially the Damaged by Aircraft Act, because Damaged by Aircraft Act looks at operator and potentially owner, but own in specific circumstances. So that does get a bit hairy there, and I have to look a bit further into it as to just lending it to someone else to use. What that connection was. Is it just a mate and they're using it, or is it something more commercial? Given you've got a REPL.
That is interesting. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so I think the big thing on all this is it's actually really challenging.
Yeah, 100%.
And I don't think anyone's got all the answers because there's so many aspects involved.
Well, at least to finance that specific element would require a bit of more specific research in those circumstances. But unfortunately, it's very much circumstantialist to the finer points, obviously.
Yep. Well, fantastic. All right, we'll get a couple more. How are we doing for time? So we've got one here that's come through and said that in terms of vicarious liability in XCAT for a volunteer-run organization, is the org liable or the individual? I think we discussed this very briefly the other day. I don't know. This seems very, very grey as well. Not that any of these other ones aren't, but I don't know. Tom, did you have any other thoughts on that one?
The only thing that comes to mind, and this is just thinking conceptually, whether there's sort of like Good Samaritan laws come to mind, whether it's something, But so if you're a volunteer and you're flying for someone else and something happens, who's liable? Good question.
Would it come back to that point, or is it only relevant to commercial? But would it come back to the idea of saying the operator, like who's supplied or who's provided the RPAS?
If they've said, come on and help us with this, and you're from your own free will, bring your RPAS, come on and operate for them to do something, and something wrong happens, I think in the first instance, I'd hazard a guess that it falls on the the pilot in the first instance. But then, with it, if there's under the direction of the volunteer organisation, what's their share of any blame? Tricky. And like I said, a lot of this stuff hasn't been. There's some aviation law, obviously, traditional stuff, but how all this liability unfolds in the RPAS space, all these issues we're talking about haven't been settled in court, as far as I'm aware. Like there might be comparable stuff in traditional aviation, as with those cases I looked at earlier, but this stuff just hasn't been tested. So this is all just us really just discussion, hypothetically trying to untangle the regulations. The court is yet to properly unpack some of these issues and how the law would unfold insofar as RPAS.
Interesting. Okay. Awesome. So we've got a couple more there. Seems to be more and more. This is a lot of very engaged audience. This is great, but we might run out of time. But I was going to say there's another one here. So from all standard operating conditions, specific wording mentioned a person. For example, a person must not operate an RPA within 30 meters of a person. As companies can be legal persons, this would apply to both parties. Is there any clarification on that definition of a person until an offence is prosecuted in court? Incidentally, if it is to be interpreted that the company is the person, then you cannot fly a drone within 30 meters of a company.
I like that thinking. So I'll have to check if normally there's a law called the Acts Interpretation Act, and that's literally a law that says what certain words mean in other laws. So that typically defines a person as a natural person and as a company, and often. But I will have to check, and it's always subject to checking to the regs to see if there's an overriding position in the regs that say a person in this instance is a natural person, human being, or whether it goes to the default of person being a company. And that's a really good question actually. Casa may have written that thinking natural person, human being, and then didn't think that, oh gosh, if that's a company. That's a really good question. So I think it's a matter of I'd be interested to check. Does the civil aviation safety regs define a person as a natural person or not? And if not, goes back to the Acts Interpretation Act and therefore potentially a company, which creates this really weird situation you've just outlined, which is really cool. Well, not cool, but I find that interesting.
Interesting.
But can you put that on notice, someone? Because I do want to see if person is defined in the aviation regs. I'd love to look that up just for my personal interest and then share it.
For sure. I was going to say I might do an export because we've got probably 2 minutes have gone well over, but I want to be respectful of your time. But we'll maybe time for one more question if that's all right, and then we'll maybe follow up at the end of this and send out some answers if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. So one from Garen here sent through and said, can you point out the difference of consequential loss versus liability insurance? Is it for asset cover, such as causing a power outage and all claims arising from that?
Yeah, well, consequential. It depends where the consequential loss is carved out. And if you're an operator and flying, it'd be advised you have a master services agreement that excludes you from consequential loss for that person suing you for consequential loss. But sorry, that question, can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so can you point out the difference of consequential loss versus liability insurance? Is it for asset cover, such as causing a power outage and all claims arising from that?
Well, so if you are liable for consequential loss, those are the things that not outside the direct loss. So, the drone your hull got smashed hitting a power line, but it knocked out power for the rest of the suburb for a week. That would be the consequential loss from that. So you'd have to see whether your policy covers consequential loss or not, and also whether you can contract out of that, because a lot of contracts will say, a lot of commercial contracts say that no one here is liable to each other for consequential loss. So if you've made a mistake on if you're flying operating on a mine site or a job for me, and you crash into something that's direct loss, but then you've knocked all these other timelines out, the consequential loss by doing something on my job site, and you say no consequential loss, we say no, you're going to be compensated for the direct loss, not for everything else you've stuffed up by reason of that accident. But I'm not sure about comparing. Sorry, I don't completely understand consequential loss versus part of the question.
I think my reading of it is the standard insurance covers you for the public liability and things like that, and actually consequential loss is this other thing that you actually have to get special coverage for.
Well, yeah, what you want to look at what it says, and it'd be definitely control finding consequential loss or indirect loss as well. There's other ways it's defined in policies and in contracts. I'd just be looking for that word to see what it says about it, because normally it will say something about it, or it might just say direct, and therefore there's no consequential loss provisions, or it's silent. So, but just main thing I said about that is always look for those terms in contracts, because that can expand the scope massively, whether you're liable for direct, indirect, consequential loss.
Gotcha. Great. All right. Well, we might have to just leave it there, but yeah, we might have to export these questions out and answer them, then send them out to everyone. But I think that was from Garrett. I think there was just one from Steve, but I think that's more of an answer to maybe our question earlier. But Steve said 7 kilos is near enough to 15 pounds, which we followed the US. So I think that might have answered that question there. So some
And I
predated
think we
ones.
also had another answer from Stephen Young around saying micro just needs to be registered for commercial purposes.
Gotcha.
What my understanding is
And
all RPA have to be registered, all RPA. I think that's what the regs say. So I agree with that. Even if
Great.
RPA,
Brett
you need
also chipping
registration and
in.
accreditation.
Oh, sorry, and also Brett chipping in on the 3 nautical miles of uncontrolled as well. I think there was a question around that.
Oh, okay, right. Yep.
So thanks everyone for all your input.
I was going to say this is probably the most engaged we've seen it. So thanks heaps for that, guys. And yeah, we'll export it out, make sure we follow up those questions. But those are Tom's details on there as well. So if anyone, hopefully not in any bad conditions, but want to talk to Tom more, his details there, and feel free. I'm sure he'd love to help, and we can go from there. But yeah, well over time. But thanks so much, Tom. Really appreciate it, mate. I know you got a lot on, so thanks heaps, and I hope everyone got a lot out of it. And yeah, we'll send out the recording if anyone else wants to watch it again.
Thanks, everyone. Hope you took some value, and thanks for taking your lunch break. Appreciate it. Always happy to help as well if you want to be in contact.
Fantastic.
Thanks
Thanks again,
everybody.
Dave, for joining us as
Thanks,
well.
Tom.
Thanks, Steve. See you, Zay.
Yeah, bye.